My guest today is Janet Singer Applefield. Born Gustawa Singer, Janet is a Polish Holocaust survivor whose parents made the harrowing decision to leave Janet in the care of others when she was just 7 years old in order to protect her. Janet was a hidden child until the war ended, but was miraculously reunited with her father years later. Janet has chronicled her story in her memoir, Becoming Janet, Finding Myself in the Holocaust. Janet, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm well, thank you.
Good. It's a real privilege to have you on. So look, you start your book by saying that your father, Alexander Singer, is at the heart of your book, of your memoir. Can you tell us why this is?
Uh, my father was my hero. He um, searched for a long time until he found me after the war. He had no idea where I was and or what happened to me. And miraculously, he found me in an orphanage. Um, he also was my role model because he taught me to um, not to be hateful, not to be resentful, uh, and to judge people basically on their character and on their actions, and not because of color of their skin or their religion or any type of ethnic ethnic background. Uh, those are just a few reasons why my father, is at the center of this story. He also, when we were first reunited, he wanted to know exactly what happened to me, and I was a budding teenager, and I was a little reluctant to talk about what had happened to me, but um, he made sure that I everything was written down, so he would know. So I think that's when I really started to think about, writing my story, writing everything down.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, at what age did you start to feel like you were able to talk about what you had been through?
Uh, it was several years, quite a few years later, that I started to speak about this. Actually, it was in the early 80s when I started. I joined an organization called Facing History and Ourselves. Um, and This is a organization that trains educators on how to teach about um, genocide and, of course, Holocaust also. So that's when I began. But for a long time, I was reluctant to tell my story because I devalued my experience because I had never been in any camps. So I thought, well, those people are the survivors. I didn't see myself as a survivor. So it was a process to go through. And when I finally realized the importance of sharing this story.
So what was that feeling like, if you don't mind my asking? Because obviously you've lost a lot of family members during the Holocaust, but as you say, you yourself were not in any of the camps. So how did that feel to have been in the Holocaust, to have lost family members there, but to maybe not feel like you were uh, allowed in some way to discuss this?
At first, it was very difficult to talk about this, but in time, I realized that I have a responsibility to speak about this because I survived. My life was spared, and with that, I felt that I have uh, that responsibility. And also, I feel that I'm a witness of history, and and the people that hear me speak become witnesses after they've heard my story. And I'm also the voice for all those victims who no longer have a voice.
Yeah, and it's so important that you know Holocaust survivors such as yourself continue to speak and lend their voice to this. Let me take us back to the very beginning. I mean, do you remember what life was like before Hitler's army invaded Poland?
Yes, I do. I have very fond memories of those first 4 years of my life. I lived among, you know, many family members, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I was the first grandchild in the family, so I was pampered and spoiled. I had an uncle who had a motorcycle with a little sidecar. He used to put me in there, strap me in, take me to the candy store, take me for rides. I remember the holidays, preparing with my mother and my grandmother. Um, so those were wonderful memories that I held on to throughout the war. Those were the memories that really helped me um, to not to go crazy with what was happening.
Yeah. So, cut to September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. Um, how did life change for you personally?
At the very beginning of the war, um, um, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, and one aunt and uncle, and my mother and I, and my baby sister um, attempted to escape by heading to Russia, and that's where we ended up in Russia. I knew terrible things were happening because my mother was crying, my grandmother was crying. I didn't understand what was going on because I was so young, but I knew something dangerous or bad was going on, and life really changed because there was a shortage of food. I remember going with my mother to the forest to pick mushrooms. Um, so there was a shortage of food, there was shortage of work, um, and we were separated from my father because my father and my uncles tried to join the Polish army. Of course, Poland was defeated in 1 month's time. So when that happened, my father and my uncles joined this caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland and heading to Russia. And when he first arrived, he had no idea where we were. Of course, communication in those days was much different than it is today. My father advertised in the newspaper looking for us, and in time he found us, and we were reunited with my dad.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. I can't imagine putting an advert in the newspaper and finding my missing family that way. It's such a foreign concept to me.
Different times, very different.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned your uncles there, and I wanted to ask you about your uncles. Your uncles Henrik and Joseph were murdered. There's also another uncle, Uncle Arthur, who was shot. Can you tell us what you understand to have happened to them, and how did you find out what had happened to them?
Uh, well, my two uncles who were living with us in Russia, um, one day there was an announcement that said that any men who needed a job should report at the town hall. So my two uncles went. My dad didn't go that day because he wasn't feeling well. And when they arrived there was a marching band playing. They were made to sing nationalistic songs, and then they were marched to a nearby ravine, told to undress, and they were shot. And that evening, we waited for my uncles to come home, and they didn't. My other uncle at the time was back in Poland. He was hiding in an attic, and a young boy denounced him, and my uncle was arrested by the Gestapo and shot. Actually, he was shot while he was tying his shoes. And you asked how I know some of this very detailed information. In 2012, I was contacted by a young Polish historian who was at the time getting her doctorate at the University of Warsaw on the subject of the Holocaust. And she found me on my website online. And as a result of that connection, she has done this tremendous amount of research on my family. So I know exactly what happened to each member of my family. And she continues to do research. And currently, actually, she's one of the top researchers in, I don't know, in Poland or on the subject itself. Her name was Dr. Karolina Pans. And so that's how I know so much about my family.
What was that like in 2012 when you had that information? Was there a sense of closure?
It was because my story changed over time. It evolved. At first, I didn't know what happened to my mother. I remember my first trip to Poland. We went to Auschwitz, and I saw this huge case um, of suitcases, displaying hundreds of suitcases, and one of them was with the name Singer. Of course, that's my maiden name, and I thought, well, could that have been my mother? And then another time, I came across some documents that possibly could have stated that my mother was shot in the camp Płaszów. So I thought that was the story. And finally, in 2012, when Dr. Carolina Pans did all this research, I knew exactly what happened, and there was some closure to know exactly, how my family was murdered.
And what did happen to your mother, if you don't mind telling our listeners?
So on the few days prior to, well, I'll back up. Sorry. Uh, in August of 1942, after my parents ran out of all options to escape, they made this decision to give me away. And so I left with a nanny. Her name was Maria. In the meantime, there was an order that stated that all the people from that town and all the surrounding towns had 3 days to report at an area outside of Krakow called Wieliczka. Um, so my parents made a decision to separate from each other. Their thinking was that if they did that, one of them might survive. So they went to this appointed place, and when they arrived, there were approximately 12,000 people congregated in this big field. Um, Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. My father was one of those men. Another approximately 1,000 old people and children were taken directly to the forest. They were made to dig their own graves, and they were shot. And the remaining people were put into 53 boxcars marked with the letter B for the death camp Belzec. So my mother was one of those victims sent to Belzec, and she and my grandmother and other family members were victims of that uh, camp,
Mm,
and that's how they died.
mm. Let me let me take you to spring of 1942, a few months before this. You and your family were forced into a ghetto, and you write about the conditions. And you said that one night your father saw two Jewish men hanging from gallows with handwritten signs pinned to their coats that said kosher meat. Can you tell us what you remember about the ghetto?
I remember the fact that there were rations for food, and I understand that Jewish people were given fewer rations, so uh, there was difficulty in finding food, um, and we all were cramped in a very small apartment. Um, I don't remember very much more than that.
Before you were taken, you write about how in your cramped apartment, the Gestapo burst in and they forced your mother to undress and they stole possessions, including her fur coat. As a child witnessing this, that must have been incredibly difficult and traumatic. What was going through your mind at that time?
I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't obviously understand the concept of war. I just knew I was always afraid of uniforms. I was afraid when I heard German language spoken, and um, uh, and I understood that something bad was going on, but I had no concept of what this was really, what was really going on. I didn't understand.
Yeah, you're too young. Um, before your before your mother um, was murdered, her and your father took the very painful decision to leave you with a relative stranger, and this was the last time you saw your mother before she was murdered. Um, do you remember any discussions about this, or was it just one day you were with them and one day you weren't?
I remember that my parents sat me down and explained that I was going to go with Maria, that I should be good, I should listen, and I should be brave. And I have really blocked out the act, the emotions of what must have been going on because I had just lost my baby sister. I was separated from my grandparents, and I didn't. It was so traumatic uh, for 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 me as a little girl because so many changes were taking place, and and here I was leaving my parents and going with a total stranger. And as a mother today, I try to imagine what that must have been like for my parents to give their remaining child away. It's very hard for me to imagine that. I think it was a very brave and selfless act on their part.
Yeah. I mean, look, it saved your life, and you're with us here now today. Um, you you were given a new name, a new identity by one of your temporary caretakers. That you were given the name and identity of Chrissia, who you learned was actually the name of a 7-year-old girl who had died. Um, what do you think the impact of having your name changed and taking on this new identity did to you as a child? What was that like?
I learned um, how to be to adapt to any situation, whatever I was told to do, and whatever was happening. I was able to accept and adjust to that. Um, it was strange. It was very strange to have a new name, and that was really drilled into me. I always knew that I was Jewish, and I always knew that I had to keep it a secret. Um, so I was really hiding in plain sight, um, and um, and I knew I had to hide my emotions. I remember um, sometimes, going to bed and crying, lying down and crying, and I couldn't be seen crying, but that's what I used to do.
The whole time throughout the war, you knew you were Jewish. What did being Jewish mean to you then, as a little girl?
It meant remembering the traditions of remember the holidays. I remember preparing for the holidays. I remember going to the synagogue with my family. I remember my the men praying, and those memories were really very important for me to have because they really helped me. They gave me some foundation to go on. Just remembering those wonderful times.
Hmm. I mean, that's brilliant because that your Jewish identity essentially helps sustain you through this, which is remarkable to hear.
Mm-hmm.
A moment ago, you said that you essentially had to hide in plain sight, and in the book, you say that the way you believe that the way you looked with your blonde hair and green eyes possibly saved your life, which is astonishing. I mean, what feelings do you have about this possibility? The idea that any moment, if they knew, you could have been uh, found out, and the only thing that disguising this would may have been your appearance.
Um, I knew that I looked, my appearance was that of an Aryan child. I could have been German or Polish or Scandinavian. And, the Nazis were trying to develop a master race, and they had this idea that people should have certain features and certain appearance. So even more recently, when I've returned to Poland um, with my son carried a little picture of me as a 4 year old, and he would show it to people, strangers, and engage in a conversation, and they would all say, "Oh, she had the good looks." So even today, that prevails, that good looks, and I do believe that's saved me.
You said in the book that acts of kindness from strangers gave you the gift of gratitude, and you describe a woman who helped you when you were abandoned. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
I had been left in a church, and I was told to wait for my cousin, who at the time was my caretaker, and she was going across the street to meet her Polish boyfriend. She told me in a cafe. So I sat and I waited in this church for hours and hours, and she never returned for me. I finally walked out of the church, and I crossed the street, and I saw the whole street was cordoned off, and I heard people say that the Gestapo had come and they arrested everybody in that cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street crying. I had no idea what to do. Suddenly, a woman came up to me and very quickly put me under her cape. And she asked me, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" I explained that my situation. I said I was waiting for my cousin. She's gone. I said, "Could you please take me to the bus? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, "No, no, no, you're too little." And she's the person, she was the concierge of the apartment building, the same apartment building where the cafe was, but she took me into upstairs to the third floor to the apartment of a woman by the name of Alicia Goomp. Alicia was the one who kept me, and but if not for that woman who took me off the street, that one act of taking me off the street, I most likely would not be here. So it is so important to be mindful of the kinds of acts and things that we all do, because it's true. Even the smallest act of kindness is a ripple effect.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, let me ask, what happened after that?
So after that, Alicia asked me, "What, where you from? What happened?" And I had a story that I practiced to tell if I was ever captured. The story was that I was the daughter of a Polish officer, and both of my parents were killed in a bombing raid, and I came from Warsaw. And so Alicia accepted my story. She said I could stay, but I couldn't stay in that particular apartment for three reasons. One was that Alicia's mother was, who also had an apartment in that building, uh, was very active in the Polish resistance. And in her apartment, she ran a hospital. She had shortwave radios and ammunition. Another reason I couldn't stay there was that there was an SS officer living in the building. And the third reason was when the Gestapo made an arrest, they always returned for a second time. So they were afraid to leave me there. So that early evening, the oldest son took me and we walked for several miles. We came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church, and Alicia's brother in law was the administrator of that farm. So I remained on the farm.
Hmm. And I need to ask, do you know what happened to your cousin, your caretaker?
I do not know what happened to her. We've never been able to find that out. Um, one story or one possibility I heard was that she might have been arrested as a political prisoner and sent to Ravensbrück, but I'm not certain.
You describe in the book some frightening times in Poland once the war was over, with Polish people who were still filled with anti-Semitic hate. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so when I was reunited with my father, we went back to our town and we moved in to my grandparents' old apartment above their store. We lived there with three other survivors, but there were notes posted on our front door saying we would be murdered. And my father went to the police chief asking for protection, and the police chief said all he could do was to give my father a gun. So my father slept with a gun. A couple of my father's good friends were murdered after the war. Young men driving in a car, they were ambushed and shot. And I remember going to that funeral. We moved out of our town eventually because we thought it was, my father thought it was too dangerous to remain there. So anti-Semitism after the war was very, very significant.
Yeah. When you did reunite with your father, I mean, first of all, can you tell us how you did reunite?
So I was in the orphanage. My my cousin's father found where I was, and he came to get me. And but he turned me over to the refugee center. So I was there for a while until a woman by the name of Lena Kuchler came along. Every day she came because there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors. She was looking for her family, and she came across this room full of children and decided that she had to do something. So in time, she was able to open two orphanages. One orphanage was for children who had tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, and because the Polish hospitals refused to take Jewish children, so they had to open the second orphanage. Um, so one day, Lena went back to the refugee center to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his child. She said to him, "Can you describe what your daughter looks like?" And he described a girl with long blonde braids and a birthmark on her left thigh. And Lena said, I think I have your daughter. So she called me down. She came back to the orphanage, called me down to her office, and told me that my father has survived and he's coming.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, I'll always remember that reunion because when I first saw him, I was so frightened of him. He looked like a skeleton, and he was hugging and kissing me and telling me he's going to take me. And I didn't want to go because for the first time, I had friends, and Lena was our mother. We called her mother. My father was really sick. He couldn't take me, so he rented a room near me, near the orphanage, and we saw each other every day. We got reacquainted, and in time we were, he took me, and we left, went back to our town.
Yeah. And cut to a few years ahead, 1947, you both moved to America. Why did you decide to move to America? How did this come about?
So my father had two brothers. One was living in Palestine at the time. He immigrated in 1934 to Palestine, and the other brother was living in the United States. He he had escaped. He had been a student in Italy when the war broke out, and he escaped. I mean, sorry, yes, he escaped to Shanghai, China, and then he became prisoner of war of the Japanese. But that's another interesting story. But so he had two brothers, one in Palestine, one in America. And he came to me and he said, "Where do you want to go?" And I thought for a moment and I said, "I want to go to America because I heard that money grew on trees." No idea where that came from, but sounded very good. And of course, it took a couple of years for us to get the proper documentation. And in March of 1947, we were able to leave Poland.
And then you went to the States, and all of a sudden you were having to navigate a new school and language, and a new Americanized name, Janet. What was all of this? What was all of this like?
That was very strange and different. My uncle took me to school to register me for school, and I had never been to school, so I knew how to read and write in Polish, but I didn't speak English. And right there in the school office, while he was trying to register me, he said to me, "What name do you want? You have to have an American name." So that caught me by complete surprise. I had not thought about that before. And I came up with the name Jeanette because we had a cousin who was French. She lived in Paris. She used to visit in the summertime, and she was very beautiful and glamorous. And she had, I remember, long red nails, which really made me very excited. And her name was Jeanette. So I said, "Jeanette." And my uncle turned to the school secretary and said, "Her name is Janet." So that's how I became Janet, right on the spot there.
Wow.
Mm.
And what when you did move to the States, what state did you move to?
We moved to New Jersey because that's where my uncle was. And but we had a very serious problem because we came on a 90-day visitor's visa. In 90 days, we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in the United States is if my father married an American citizen. So the family looked around and they found him a wife. So in that short period of time, I had a new stepmother, a new name, new appearance because they cut my hair, new friends, new language. Everything was new. And I had a
Yeah,
wonderful group of girlfriends in eighth grade who took me under their wing and socialized me and really helped me out.
that's lovely. And did you take to New Jersey immediately, or did it take some getting used to?
No, I was very happy. I was very excited. Um, I, I had a good experience.
Was it what was it like to be able to just be Jewish without having to worry about anyone knowing?
Well, that's a very interesting question because I was very uncomfortable being Jewish after the war. I grew up hearing that it was such a terrible thing to be. So it took a fairly long process for me to come to terms with being comfortable being Jewish.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Um, Now, jumping ahead to the present day, as I'm sure you well know, anti-Semitism has risen globally following the 7th of October Hamas terrorist attacks. Um, as someone who has lived through the Holocaust, do you see any similarities between anti-Semitism then and anti-Semitism now?
Um, yes, in the sense that, you know, in Poland and Germany, there it's like sprouting seeds. It started very small and it grew bigger, 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 bigger. I'm feeling that this hatred of not only Jews but other ethnic groups um, has been unleashed, and it's growing and it's spreading, and it's very upsetting for me, very triggering me. Um, so there are some similarities.
Has this this rise in hate come as a surprise at all to you?
Yes, yes, definitely. I mean, we hope and we think that we learn from the past, from history, and yet I feel like we're not learning. We're ignoring signs. We are ignoring, uh, and we're not learning from the past.
Mm. there's there have been a lot of demonstrations at the moment against Israel, and at a lot of these demonstrations, we see a lot of signs, placards, chants, that sort of thing. And one of the things we see a lot from these protesters is comparisons between Israel and the Nazis. You will see things like Israel equals Nazis and those sorts of things. Um, I don't know if you've come across that, but if you've had, I would like to know what you think of that.
Well, personally, I have not come across that, but I certainly have read about it, and I think to make that kind of a comparison is wrong. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense at all. Um, I hate war. I hate people being killed on both sides, and but I, but comparing it to Nazi atrocities, I can't go that far.
Mm. Um, Let me ask you a question now as we begin to wrap up. I ask this question to all of our guests. If someone who is not Jewish comes to you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
I think, um, well, I'd be very grateful if someone was willing to help. I think it's important for them to be proactive, to speak out anytime they hear any kind of slur or ethnic joke. I think maybe joining some groups that are active in fighting anti-Semitism, reporting any incidents, maybe writing letters to their Congress people, um, and maybe joining some kind of groups that are fighting this kind of a cause. Um, Encouraging schools to have programs on anti-Semitism to educate people. I think education is the most important aspect of combating anti-Semitism. People are so ill-informed and often spread wrong information.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Janet, before you go, please tell the listeners what have you got going on, what have you got coming up, and where can people find you?
So I have a website, janetapplefield.com, that lists some of my upcoming events. Um, and the book is available in any bookstores and online also. And it's also an ebook. And right now it's being translated to be an audiobook. Um, and I would appreciate if people could follow me on social media, Instagram and Facebook. Um, the handle is at Janet Applefield. And I think I've covered all bases. Also, I'm an avid speaker. I speak to over 4,000 students and adults every year. So if people are interested in having me give a talk, I'm happy to do that.
I think a lot of people will be interested. You have an absolutely remarkable story, and I'm really very grateful that you've decided to share it with us today. Janet Applefield, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.
Thank you for having me.